The main focus today is to explore and discuss how QGetGo and generated code in general will interact with modules, because we sort of got a current state of the world, and we need to sort of explore, as part of the modules experiment, what things will look like, at least initially, with also a view to how things should ultimately look down the line as well. So that's the plan for today, to kickstart that discussion. I don't think it's one we'll necessarily complete today, but we have a proposal or a plan for what we will do for day one of the modules experiments. Would very much appreciate feedback from folks. That plan also sort of has an idea of what things should look like in the future. Again, would appreciate feedback on that as well as we go. But let's start with an update on progress. It's been a bit of a quieter time over the last 3 weeks, as it were, with most people in Europe being on holiday. It's a sort of a fairly big holiday time in Europe. I didn't do anything really modules related, but instead made some progress on the LSP side of things, which folks in Slack will have seen. So that work has started. We have been making changes to the central registry implementation we have, with the auth-n and auth-z aspects of that landing in the central registry implementation, and also working out how to have the command Q play nicely with the central registry and the GitHub-based device flow OAuth that we talked about last time. That's also we've worked out a mechanism, a simple mechanism for day one on how we will have those tokens be persisted. That's something we will very likely revisit down the line. It's just a simple implementation for day one that gets us unblocked. Front end for the central registry is also in progress. Excuse me. We exploring pretty closely using, I don't know whether I'm going to pronounce this correctly, but ShadCN. Maybe somebody else can come up with a better pronunciation of that, as a very nice open source way of building good looking UIs. Also exploring looking at Subframe as well. But yeah, we'll hopefully show some visual progress on things at the next call. Before we move on, has anybody got any questions? Daniel, Roger, any points that I've missed in terms of updates that you would call out? Go for it, Daniel.
One that I was just realizing we forgot to add to the list here is the new version of the proposal docs that we were talking about last month.
Yep. So the plan for that, as we talked about last month, the plan for that is to release the updated versions of the proposal docs when we, quotes, go live with the modules experiment. So that still remains the plan. Reason being is that will allow us to sort of match what's in the, quotes, proposal docs with what we actually go with. An interesting point in the sort of a point that's very relevant as far as that's concerned is the QGetGo stuff we're about to talk through. So it's sort of almost better that we haven't published the V3 of those docs right now, because we would be already revising it somewhat with a plan on what we're going to do as far as QGetGo and generated artifacts are concerned. But thanks for the reminder. We still have that as a something we will release the V3 as part when we say, okay, we're live with the modules experiment now. Cool. Okay, so let's get straight in then to the discussion on QGetGo and how generated code more generally interacts with modules. Just before we get into this, none of this is set in stone. We're very much wanting to be guided by real world situations here. So if you have a real world situation, and I'll call out, say thank you to Richard, first of all, who's already sort of kicked the tires on this preemptively, that wouldn't work with what we're going to talk through, please shout. That's the whole point of these feedback sessions, is that this is a very early share of what it is we're planning to do to fix this situation that Richard's identified. We'll get this as part of the modules experiment so that when it's live, people can kick the tires quite a bit harder. But please, this is not set in stone. Shout as early as you can if you spot something that's going to not work, basically, from your perspective. So thank you, Richard. Just before we get into the issue that Richard's raised, a quick reminder on where we are today. Basically, this is pre-modules experiment. We QGet all the things. So if you want to depend on Kubernetes, the prescribed way at the moment because we don't have the concept of publishing modules. And because Kubernetes uses Go as the source of truth, is to use kuget-go. And this is a very rough diagram. Apologies, it was a bit rushed in pulling these diagrams together. But let's just assume we are the owner of github.com/company/m1. And we want to
Are you sharing your screen, by the way? I'm not sure you're sharing your screen. At least I'm not seeing it.
Oh, okay. I beg your pardon. That's very bad. I'm sorry. Thank you. Let me try that again. Thank you. I'm sorry. I got my screens all lined up. So let me quickly start from the top to skip through those slides. Happy New Year, everyone. Update on progress, discussion on kuget-go, update on progress. Here's what I talked through in terms of the update on progress. Everyone's up to date on the slides now. I kicked off with a bit of a ramble on this piece here, and now we're into this slide here, which is what I was talking through when Roger very kindly pointed out that I wasn't sharing my screen. So here we are, sharing the screen. If I own github.com/company/m1, and we also depend today in this pre-modules world on M2, which we have published. Actually, what that requires us to do is to have vended, in the loosest possible sense, M2 in the PKG directory in M1. What it also requires us to do, if M2 relies on Kubernetes, is run kuget-go in M1 as well, such that we have the kubernetes.io code. And I'm being a bit loose here with my module and package path, but hopefully you get the gist of it. That is also generated as part of M1, even though strictly speaking, the dependency only exists from M2. So you can sort of see it exists in the gen directory in M2, but it also needs to exist in the gen directory in M1 because we don't consult M2's gen directory when we're resolving packages within M1. So that's where we are today. Richard has kindly already kicked the tires on what has landed in the QLang Q repository and has raised issue 2746. The basic premise of that is that qmod-tidy, which is a key part of the modules implementation, does not work alongside kuget-go. Reason being, qmod-tidy sees an import path like kates.io/something and goes, I have no idea where to get that from. And the answer is that it's sitting in the gen directory. And so we've got to work out, well, we're not going to be in a situation day one where the kates.io stuff is all published. And as we'll come to in a second, that's generally going to be the case, is that we can't always rely on everything having been published. But thank you, Daniel. It gets a 404 in reality. So this is something we were/are aware of. It's something we had talked about before. But still, Richard, thank you for raising it because it helps to sort of focus discussion. It is not unique to Kubernetes, just to call that out. In the sort of more general case, because kuget-go is not unique to Kubernetes, it sort of could apply to any situation where somebody today is relying on kuget-go generated code, however, whether Kubernetes or not. Nor is it unique to public modules either, because of course you could theoretically, and indeed in practice, run kuget-go on private Go code. And so we could be talking about private Q modules in the same sense as well. Richard very kindly, he and I went backwards and forwards just ahead of this call today so that I was somewhat prepared for this slide here. And Richard, correct me if any of this is wrong, please. In Richard's case, he doesn't need/want to run kuget-go per se. Instead, he just wants to pin on a version of Kubernetes and would be happy with regular module dependencies. Put another way, he'd be happy to run qmod-tidy instead of running kuget-go for the Kubernetes dependencies in this situation. I see a thumbs up from Richard. I'm glad I summarized that correctly. There's sort of a bit of an open question as to how many people are in the same situation as Richard in that situation, as far as, yeah, I'd be much happier/prefer to just run qmod-tidy. Just as interesting is the number of people who are not in that situation, who actually would want some other sort of behavior in that situation. We'll come on to all of these in a bit, but please just anyone interrupt if you want to at any point here. But hang on a second, the modules experiment isn't live yet, I hear you say. True, not officially, but as we've said and been advertising for the last few modules calls, code is landing in QLangQ. So Richard, having kicked the tires here, is him just having gone to the tip of QLangQ and actually looking through some of the commits there. So much appreciated, Richard. If anybody else wants to do the same, by all means. We haven't got a lot of documentation right now. So for those people who are trying it, you're effectively doing it at your own risk with whatever you can read, etc. And we're working as fast as we can to get to a point where we have got the documentation and we are sort of live with the experiment. So I just wanted to say thank you again to Richard, and others can try this if they want to at their own risk, etc., etc. So the ultimate end goal, at least as far as Kubernetes is concerned here, is that there are published Kubernetes modules, because it's somewhat busy work, or in fact entirely busy work, for people to have to run kuget-go for Kubernetes. And I'd be interested if anyone has a sort of a counterpoint to that, because Kubernetes is a public thing. It's got published versions. It's sort of very well defined, therefore, if we are using Kubernetes version X inside and we want to configure that thing, that we would therefore want to effectively rely on configuration schema for version X of Kubernetes. Running kuget-go is a sort of then a detail within that, where you need to sort of understand, well, how does version X of Kubernetes map to these packages that are used by Kubernetes, etc. It's a lot of detail that our hypothesis is that nobody who is operating in this situation cares about. There are situations where people would care about the underlying packages, but in the general case of just configuring Kubernetes, not. So those published Kubernetes modules should exist, with the note that for the, when I say initial central registry, I should have been slightly more explicit there and saying for the modules experiment, the central registry will be limited to github.com based modules. We can come to that a bit later on. So that being the case, is that though, whilst that is the end goal for Kubernetes, it's not the case that we can just say, oh, let's get rid of kuget-go, for a number of reasons. There are situations, both public and private, where we will always need kuget-go, or qimport-go, as we might well call it, is one of our open issues captures. One of those reasons is that, as we've talked about, we can't start day one of the modules experiment and hope or have as actually the case that everything is published as modules. That just is not going to be reality. So kuget-go will need to exist as a stopgap before those modules themselves are actually published. For example, the k8s.io ones, or indeed the k8s.io dependencies. But sort of more fundamentally, kuget-go will always exist as part of the Q toolchain, and be used as part of publishing a Q module that has Go as its source of truth. And potentially there are other reasons why kuget-go will always exist as well. So I just wanted to make clear on this slide here that we're not trying to eliminate kuget-go. It will need to exist for very valid reasons beyond that sort of end goal of wanting to publish the Kubernetes modules. But the principal question exists is, well, what do we do for day one of the modules experiment? Richard and others, and anyone who sort of falls into that category of saying, well, I'm in Richard's situation of just wanting to configure Kubernetes, please get out of my way, are blocked at the moment because qmodtidy does not work for them. It doesn't work alongside kuget-go. So our plan is to continue to support the q.mod gen directory. This is quite a high-level plan, so please chip in with any questions you might have. We have a number of open questions, but we've fairly well wrapped our hands around what the open questions are at this stage. As to when a q.mod/gen directory should be consulted, especially when it comes to a dependency that might contain a q.mod gen directory, should there be some control over this. And what we're going to do in the course of actually coming up with a day one implementation that effectively unblocks 2746 and allows Richards and others to proceed in some way, shape, or form, is capture the sort of the option space, for want of a better phrase, around making this thing configurable or not is concerned as well. We will include these changes as part of the day one changes to command queue. That is to say, day one of the modules experiment, 2746 will be solved, i.e. Richard and others will not be blocked. They will be able to run qmod tidy. However, well, not however is the wrong word there. That doesn't mean to say we will have published K8s.io modules for day one. The publishing of something will very likely follow later, because that's actually something that will, but not necessarily much later. The publishing of the K8s.io at some module path schemas is a key part to from our perspective of actually kicking the tires of dog fooding this module's implementation, i.e. can we publish something that is the result of generated code and have people consume it as just like regular dependencies? How can Richard say, for example, we're using Kubernetes version 1.28, I want all the configuration schemas for that, or to be able to depend on them? How does he address published modules in that situation? So we see that's why we want to have published those modules and allow people to depend on them. But we're not necessarily going to have that ready for day one of the modules experiment. But just to share with you, that is sort of a goal as part of this, because it's a critical part of kicking the tires of the modules implementation. So back to what we have for day one of the modules experiment, then it's at some point after day one, day n, but where n is as small as possible, we will publish Kubernetes modules. But for day one, things will start to look a bit more like this. So let me just chat through this diagram here. It's the same M1 and M2 as before. Notice there was a dotted line around M2 before. There's a solid line now, i.e. we have published, or the company in question here has published M2. They can depend on it as a proper module dependency for that reason. Hence, it does not exist in the q.mod/pkg of M1. So the dotted line around M2 becoming solid and the disappearing from the q.mod pkg of M1 is sort of evidence of the github.com/company modules being real published modules in this situation. The one thing that does exist, though, is still this dependency on K8s.io within M2. So the sort of the easiest way, sort of day one, from an implementation perspective here, is to still require the user of M1, or M1 in this situation, to run qget-go itself in order to satisfy the K8s.io dependency. There's no change in that respect from what a user has to do today, to just relate it to the previous diagram. However, it is an annoyance given that M2 has already vendored, for want of a better phrase, that dependency on K8s.io. So I presented these as option A and option B. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive. That it might be that we actually make it configurable, one versus the other. TBC, that's sort of part of the implementation here. Notice in this diagram, which I've called option B, I've eliminated the q.mod/gen K8s.io from M1, and instead we could make it such that the resolver says, well, I see M2 depends on K8s.io and it's got the code in gen. I'll pick it up from there for those instances in M2 where it depends on K8s.io. Quite a possibility in that situation. Again, we've still got some open questions around that, but that is a possibility. Again, if I sort of capture it as the end state here, and that's where the K8s.io modules are published in some way, shape, or form, in which case we drop everything from q.mod/gen in M1 and M2, and it can be resolved as a true dependency as K8s.io in this situation. Brackets, the initial module experiment will be limited to github.com module paths. So we would need to sort of think about that in some way, shape, or form. So what is our understanding of what we're solving for in all of this? Well, for starters, I should have put here unblocking people as the number one step, and unblocking Richard. That's clearly the one thing we're trying to solve for here. We're also trying to solve for minimal changes to existing code, because that's churn that we don't want to create for people, whether it be churn that could be solved with tooling or not, doesn't really matter. It's change to existing code that is noise in some way, shape, or form for end users. This decision to continue to support q.mod/gen in the way we're proposing leaves the door open for different interpretations of q.mod/gen. As I said, if you've got a q.mod.gen in a true module dependency, how should that be used or not? And it also therefore leaves the door open for configuring how we interpret q.mod/gen wherever it may appear, and configuring therefore sort of more generally where a module or path or series of import paths are configured from or resolved from. A key thing we're doing here is, in making minimal changes, though, we're acknowledging that actually we don't really know in sort of a very sort of meta sense what the right answer is here. And we really want to be grounded by real world situations. Hence, thanks again, Richard, for raising this. It's good to understand what your real world situation here is. It would be good to try and capture others and make sure we understand how our approach here works or doesn't work for the situation. That said, it's quite possible we've missed a lot of things or some things in our analysis. Please share your use case if we have. I've realized I've been talking a lot, so I will leave things for questions or comments from folks now. Otherwise, just to be super clear what the next step is, it's for us to land further changes in command Q to fix 2746, basically, in a minimal way as possible. So Richard, theoretically speaking, you should not need to make any changes day one until such time as you want to move to some published Kubernetes modules, for example. And in that situation, we would add tooling to help that migration if, for example, there was any rewriting of import paths required. Tony, I see you've got a hand up.
Yeah, I've thought about this problem, worked on it a bit myself. And, I can think my solution to this Kubernetes thing was generate it and just put it in outside of the generated directory, and then do an import path, just, set and replace all the import paths. I'm sure better to do it with Go code because we can get to actual imports. But besides the point is that, I think, to me, the whole gen directory seems really weird, and generally speaking. And then I think, one of the problems with gen is that it leaves a lot of gaps, especially in Kubernetes. There's places where it generates any, and we can't, that's where the user directory comes in as well under q.mod. So is that going to be included? I think we had talked on a previous call about these directories just going away altogether. I don't know if you're still thinking that's going to be the long-term plan. But coming back to it, my thought on it was, I've got a little Dagger pipeline that generates the Kubernetes Q code and then just writes it into a regular directory. And I'm not sure if I actually hooked up the part to do the import writing, but I think, what if the Q team just publishes one under the Q org, and we don't use kates.io, but we use github.com/q-lang or qsh/kates and then we all have a single module that we can all depend on, and then we can also, as a community, fill in those gaps that exist in the import process.
If I may jump in, so generally this is of course the desired end state. There's always so assuming that we've done like Kubernetes, there will always be next cases where this keeps being a problem, and the problem is the following. So unlike Go, where you're basically creating a new module that builds on existing modules, and you're, might construct multiple modules. So what's more the case with Q is that you're, if you want to rely on something that's already being built in the Q in the Go ecosystem, for example, you're importing like all these modules, and you might want to be responsible for maintaining one of them, but not all its dependencies, right? So all of a sudden you're pulling in, you're mimicking all these modules at once and allowing for a gradual path where you're saying, okay, I'm just going to publish these top ones, and sort of like as time goes by, like replacing the other dependencies with something that's also published and also a module in the Q ecosystem, right? As the need arises, is a process that we think will happen over and over again, right? And for that you need some kind of mechanism. It's a little bit onerous to always ask people to do it all in one big fell swoop to convert all these modules at once. So that's really the problem that it solves for. And with this, so in my view, having this structured way, right, with a single place where you have these, let's say, temporary module placeholders, allows for a fairly graceful, progression and moving away from that. So that said, like having a user and gen directory, I can see that that's a bit, that there's definitely some simplification to be done there. But this is sort of the thought about it. And it might still be that we are moving to some, generated, like ditching these directories altogether. But at the moment, I think this is, it's not super clear where we want to go with this in the long run. And it's good to build some experience before throwing it all away.
Just to quickly answer a couple of points, Tony, you talked about the goal of having a central place where people can contribute those refinements, for want of a better phrase, to the Kubernetes module. Absolutely. Again, I've just gone back to this slide here of, I think, again, it would be interesting if people disagree with that for exactly the reasons that you sort of articulated. That is a good end goal, right? Is that there can be a single point of collaboration in that situation, which is, after all, one of the main points of modules, where those sorts of things can happen. So in that situation, the K8s.io stuff, perhaps exactly as you say, under some GitHub-based path, would effectively, by some means, combine the results of Q-Get-Go, but run in a sort of a special way where it puts it in the module that we're going to publish itself. And we also, at the same time, have some means by which the existing user overrides, not overrides, but augmentations, it coexists alongside it. So then anyone, depending on the module, gets those two for free effectively in one go by just depending on that module. Just one comment on your approach of using like an internal directory within the generating to an internal directory. I think and Marcel, I wondered whether you would pick up on this, is that one of the reasons we're not keen on that is it makes it effectively decides for the consumer of the module that has such an internal path, it decides for the consumer once and for all what version of code is used for that thing. Let's just say it's K8s.io. If it sits in Gen, we keep the option open for either using the version that is vendored within the Gen directory or not, or something else. But if it's an internal package, we just can't know. And so keeping the door open, as Marcel said, we don't know what the right answer is here, but keeping the door open to either make it configurable or choose one thing or the other just keeps the door open. I agree, it doesn't give us sort of like a firm path forward or firm way forward, but it keeps our options on the table right now. So I think that's another reason why not to do the internal directory thing is that's it. That is a path set at that point as to how that particular module or those packages would be interpreted. Colin, Tony, sorry, before I jump to Colin, Tony, does that anything else that you wanted to come back on?
Yeah, maybe I'll clarify. I didn't mean like generate into an internal directory in your own repository, although that's, I think, what the Dagger pipeline does today. But my intention was twofold. One was to explore, like, does the Kubernetes API generating Q actually change that much between versions? And it actually doesn't. It's like backwards compatible to the last version I tried in 27 something. And I went through like 8 versions in all the miners. So it looks pretty good, generally speaking. But my intention was to generate a standalone repository
Oh,
in
okay.
the end. So it's not like I wanted to make it a real dependency. It just wouldn't be cates.io. I would rewrite the import paths to be, I think it was
Oh.
like hoff.io / Hulme / cates or something, or just like something like that. And I can see that living under the Q namespace as an
They're my
official, like,
misunderstanding.
right. So let's
So
make it
that's
an
definitely the
actual
end goal, right?
module.
Yeah.
At least for Kubernetes, because it seems like Kubernetes is a nice one to pick up. It doesn't really have any follow-on dependency. I think another question I have with this is, what if I depend on 2 different modules and they have both imported Kubernetes but a different version or some dependency? Like, how does that get resolved? And along with, like, do my refinements come through from the user directory in this, stepping stone to something better?
Yeah, so I think that is that exists as, I don't want to say one of the open questions per se. The one thing I think we'll do is share something after this call that maybe it is a GitHub discussion or an issue that really sort of captures this. Maybe we'll just piggyback on 2746 to do just this of what the open issues or questions are on it. That question of different, Tony, if you're able to share a tiny bit more detail offline from this call about what that scenario is, that would be very helpful, especially if it's sort of grounded in where you talked about the different Kubernetes versions and what would happen in that situation. Because it's not like there are a number of situations that we've sort of hypothesized saying, well, this could be an issue if X, Y, and Z here. Again, coming back to the point about grounding them in real world examples of, well, what situation are you looking at, and what are the parts of that system, and how have you therefore ended up with different Kubernetes versions in that situation, and what are the issues that you're therefore running into? If we can exchange stuff offline on that, that would be really good, because I think the devil is in the detail on all of that stuff, at least based on the
Maybe I
discussions
could summarize it quickly with,
please,
this gen directory being evaluated in the MVS algorithm? Like, MVS selects versions when resolving dependencies. Is gen going to be part of that? Because if it's not, then you could have like different versions of the same dependency possibly showing up.
Yes. And that comes back to, let me just go to the right slide on this one here. I think this is probably the best slide that captures it, is that falls under the heading of different interpretations of q.mod/gen and the configuration of those different interpretations. So one way of, quotes, resolving that would be, for example, well, let's just agree the ultimate way of resolving it would be to publish the cates.io stuff and then have MVS actually resolve it. So then the gen thing sort of ceases to be a problem because it's been published and we're using the published module. Job done. Another way of resolving that would be to say that the main module takes charge and says, no, I'm going to be the arbiter and tell you what the cates.io stuff version you should be using is. And so it is a sort of a stepping stone. QGetGo would need to be run in the main module in that situation in order to resolve which version is used. Have we landed on what the right answer is as a sort of a stepping stone before the published versions? No. Do we leave the door open by allowing for different interpretations and perhaps configuring those? Hopefully, yes. And that's the thinking. So hopefully we haven't ruled out as part of deciding like a minimal change here, ways in which we could fix that problem. Have we definitively fixed the problem you're talking about? No. So I realize that's a wholly unsatisfactory answer in terms of what is the answer to it. But at the same time, I don't think we're yet totally clear exactly what that answer should look like. And it's more like we'll cross that bridge when we run into those situations.
Also depends a bit on what users want in these cases.
Yeah.
I guess maybe my final comment would be is to aim for something that's less complex and confusing to people. I think people already get confused with the whole multi-directory possibilities with how modules and imports work.
Yep. I think if you've, again, just to encourage you and others, if you've got real world situations where this multiple versions of Kubernetes comes about, the ultimate question is, would you want it in that situation to participate in MVS or not? And is it always one way or the other, or some hybrid? That's what this ultimately boils down to. And so the simplicity / configurability is really a function of, well, what do people need in these situations? Because we've hypothesized situations where MVS would be absolutely the appropriate thing, but we've also hypothesized situations where it would not be the right thing to do, where people definitely don't want, you know, the dependencies of a particular module to participate in MVS. And so we're needing to be steered here really by what people are facing. But Tony, your point about keeping things simple, totally. It's more that I don't think there's necessarily a one size fits all that allows for a simple solution that therefore works for everybody. It is our current thinking. Colin. Hello. Oh, you're still on mute, Colin, just FYI.
Sorry.
problem.
Yeah, my question is somewhat related to this, I think, maybe coming at it from a different direction. And that is, what do you imagine is the kind of thing that QGetGo produces? It sort of seems like in the pre-modules world, it seems that it's a package that was acquired in a slightly different way than other packages that you might have in your code base, right? So you have code that you wrote in the main directory structure. You have code that's under PKG in the QMod directory, which you acquired from somewhere and somehow assembled there. And then you have code that's under the Gen directory, which you acquired by a different way. And all of these are ultimately packages within your module. They seem very similar to, like, hey, I've got this directory structure that has a few packages alongside each other, and then here's some more packages that are also alongside those. And then when we get into a world with modules, and correct me if my understanding is wrong here, but it seems like a module is a unit of publishing and importing that may contain several packages. And if that's so, does the relationship still hold? Is the output of a generated package part of a module in that way, or is it some other new thing, or what? Maybe the answer is we're trying to figure that out. Thanks for coming. But that's something I don't understand.
I mean, so with the caveat that that generated stuff is packages at the moment, it's still a legacy thing and they're not modules, right? But if you think of them as modules, you could see it for now as a temporary placeholder module in lieu of the actual module being available, right? Like that's sort of where you could see this is going, right? So ideally it would always be modules, but as I said, because of this transition problem, right? Whenever you have a big Go project that you're importing, you're gonna have this transition problem, right? And so ideally there wouldn't be many gen directories at all, ideally.
Okay, so modules are going to be replacing packages rather than containing them. Is that what I should take from that?
No, modules would be ideally replacing most gen directories, right? If not all. So that would be the ideal situation. So in a steady state, there wouldn't be any gen directories, ideally.
So the idea, sorry, Marcel.
Yeah, and we are looking for simplifications, right? So for example, the fact that you have these hierarchical packages, there's probably better ways of doing it in more explicit ways. We want to get rid of that. It doesn't solve everybody's problem either. So we want to simplify the way packages work in general.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. I was, unrelatedly, I was kind of wondering if the whole like search through the directory structure would be kind of simplified or eliminated because we now have packages or modules that can allow you
orthogonal
to create
things, but
dependencies.
Yeah, this approach came from a very specific use case from a company where I used to work. It's a big company, but still, right? I mean, they also didn't use Git at all, right? Like for this, so you had actually ownerships of directories, and this whole approach made a lot of sense there, but it doesn't make sense in general. So
Mhm. Okay.
it makes sense to have something more explicit, basically, and simplify the package system. I would say also
So it
the
sounds-
multiple overlays as well.
So it sounds like the answer is we're still figuring that out, but the relationship between packages and modules will probably change as it gets figured out. And so at that point, we'll have a clearer idea of what exactly is the output of
Yeah.
Hugo Jet.
Yeah, so for example, we have, so another thing that's a bit open, this is one of the reasons why some of these points that we're saying are open. So we believe that MVS is a good algorithm to use in many cases, but we have some users that have said, like, we don't want MVS, right? We want to have explicit versions for all the imports and have two different modules that you depend on, have the same dependency with different versions. They each should get their own version, like that specific version. And in Go, that would make no sense. But in Q, there is an argument for that you could actually want that, right? And there are cases where this is completely reasonable to do. So this is also a thing that we want to keep open a little bit, right? Or at least not paint ourselves too much in the corner. So there's all these questions that really are based on experience, right? Like I've spoken to some operations people, and they say, like, don't do MVS, always get the latest version, always, and just break me. I want to be broken all the time. It's like, okay, great. For some people that might work, but maybe not.
You might be in a minority opinion there.
Yeah.
I can see what you mean by the explicit versioning. It totally makes sense to have, a V1 person and a V2 person in the same configuration, and they never need to interact unless you unify them, which may or may not work depending on the semantics of the definitions. And there's no reason why that can't, happily coexist.
Yeah.
Colin, just picking up one point you said of what will happen to the PKG directory and the gen directory. One way that I hold modules in my head is that because there is no concept of fetching remote modules today, PKG exists as like a vendor, for want of a better phrase, right? So
sure.
PKG, in the world of modules, PKG disappears, right? Because you depend on published modules as just published modules, and they you don't see them anymore because they're just there as published versioned things, exactly as you said, a unit of versioning in your modules cache, but you don't need to see them. They don't need to be vendored anymore because they're already published. The gen directory is, as Marcel said, an artifact, and hopefully I motivated in the slides, is that it's not something we can eliminate in the same way in one fell swoop, because it relies on modules that we don't own and control being published from generated artifacts. And it's always going to be the case that there's a gradual getting to the published artifacts thing that would allow us to eliminate things that would otherwise be generated from, in this case, Go code. But it's of course not limited to Go code, is that you might generate something based on protocol buffers or something, right? And that might equally be as the source of truth. That might, if that's also not published as Q natively, you might also want to generate that in some way, shape, or form as a transition step to actually publishing such a module. So it's a transition thing, and that's really the point we've landed on here of we're never going to be able to eliminate the gen directory in essence, but the end goal of having, do we, as kind of back to Tony's point of, do we want people to be able to collaborate on the generated artifacts and refinements to those augmentation? Absolutely. That gives people a single place to make such refinements, to rely on them, and to depend on them, back to Richard's point, in a way that ties back to the version of the thing they're trying to use, whether it be Kubernetes or whatever, right? So yeah, hopefully if there's anything that as we start to document things a bit more, particularly as far as migration is concerned, if there's anything that we're not doing a good enough job on in terms of saying, oh, well, what happens to this directory? Please let us know, and we'll try and improve that as well. Because questions like that of, well, what happens to my code here? We should be able to be clear of, oh, you should be able to delete this directory, etc., etc.
So when I first started using Q and including generated code, the mental model I had of it was that, okay, generated code is just part of my code base that happens to be created in a different way. I'm not handwriting it the way I would for other stuff. And it lives in a different place so that those things don't overlap, and tools can know what to do with it and so on. But it's just part of my code base. So I have a module here, and some of it I wrote by hand and some of it I generated, and there's procedures for dealing with both of those things. But as far as the rest of the world is concerned, that's an implementation detail. It sounds like where you're going is to not treat it that way because you want to be able to do NVS. And something that is in the generated directory, that would be sort of private to a module, and you now can't have two modules with two versions of it because you want to do NVS. Is that right?
No, that's actually one of the reasons why we want to leave the door open to both of those interpretations. One where it's a tiny bit tricky because anything that is generated can't participate in MVS because it's not actually a module. So that's a sort of a detail within it. But sort of let's imagine that wasn't a problem per se, but we want to allow the main module M1. Let me just go back to that diagram just in one of the. We want to allow we think we want to allow the owner of M1 to control. Let me actually go to a slightly better diagram. Possibly this one here. This is actually a good diagram. We want to allow the author of M1 to control the interpretation of the gen directory in M2. So if when consuming M2, they say, well, no, and this is kind of to the point that Marcel was making, no, it's almost like M2 is self-contained in some way, shape, or form with respect to K8s.io in this situation. So use the gen that is local to M2. Or kind of to your point of imagine now K8s.io is published. I do want it to participate in MVS. The author of M1 should be able to control that. Because otherwise, if that decision has been made for them by the author of M2, they don't have any options at that point there. And there are situations where kind of, I think to the point you're making, that one interpretation would be correct and others where the other would be correct and the right thing to do.
Yeah.
So we can't, this is part of the reason, again, back to, and I misunderstood what Tony was saying, but this is part of the reason why we don't want to generate stuff into sort of the module itself, but to keep it in that special q.mod/gen directory, because it allows us to be clear that it's in a special directory and therefore to have one of two or maybe more interpretations of that directory. And so we're sort of keeping, whilst we're not landing on the right answer, we're keeping our options open until we're clearer what those potential interpretations might actually need to be, for exactly the reason you point out, is that in some situations it would be the right thing to do for M2 to be consumed as if K8s.io was sort of vendored as part of it, but somewhere it would be the wrong thing to do.
I guess that is actually my situation now that I understand clearly what you're talking about.
Oh, okay.
Here. I've done qget-go to generate M2. It's the Ray project. Maybe no one here is familiar with that, but it's the machine learning thing that runs on Kubernetes and therefore has like big configuration files that include schema from Kubernetes. Here's my structure, and then this field has to now include this Kubernetes structure, and that's a particular version of it. And the Ray Go code will choke if you give it the wrong version of Kubernetes, because it's doing its internal validation of that as this must be, Kubernetes v1 or v1 beta 1 or something like that. And then I've got, I'm M1, I've got my own code that consumes that code. And so I don't want to break M2 by giving it the wrong version of Kubernetes.
So in that situation, you don't want it to participate as part of MVS. You want effectively the vendored code to be the versions that apply. Almost to phrase it another way, is it relevant that you actually depend on Kubernetes in that situation? As in, if you sort of imagine erasing the Ray's dependency on the Kubernetes stuff, i.e., you just have the types themselves. It sort of sounds like it's not relevant that you actually depend on the Kubernetes code itself per se there, other than to get those definitions. But if they were sort of erased, for want of a better phrase, the name of them isn't relevant. It's the structure that's relevant.
Yeah, kind of. I think, the other thing is that in my case, M1 also depends on Kubernetes.
Yeah.
And in theory, because it's doing other Kubernetes things, right?
Yeah.
Now, in theory, that could be a different version of Kubernetes. That would be the version of Kubernetes that I'm running on my cluster. I suspect if you had a different version of Kubernetes, it wouldn't work in practice. But in theory, M1 has a different version of Kubernetes.
We had that diagram as well, interestingly, in our discussions around this, for exactly that reason. And that's the situation where, exactly as you're articulating, and I'll just sort of keeping an eye on the time, it might be good for us to follow up offline, Colin, on this to just make sure that we've fully grokked your situation there, and indeed others who fall into that situation, because I think that sort of points us towards that control in certain situations. Marcel?
Yeah, no, this would be really interesting to know, right? Like whether users have situations where these two different versions of Kubernetes between M1 and M2 must be the same, even when they're using gen directories, and situations where they must be the same or where they must not be the same, right? Where they really. So if we have, it would be interesting to know by either case, right? Where you say like, no, these have to be two different versions, or no, we really want them to be the same version, but they're a gen directory, so. Like, how do we deal with that?
Yeah.
Colin, thanks for raising that. If it's okay, just in the interest of time, we'll follow up afterwards. Thank you very much, though. Cedric, you've been patiently waiting. Apologies.
Yeah. Hey, everybody. My personal thinking on this is, even Kubernetes has a universe of basically its own type system with the API version and kind, right? Some of them I think are models as open API schemas. So you can really have any kind of version. And to me, like, fundamentally, Q models other systems, right? It's not going to be the source of truth for a lot of different things, especially internal tools that will probably never be published.
Mm-hmm.
So for us, to be able to effectively close over those systems, I think have to move more into the build system space, where we think of everything as, as a dependency graph for a queue. And so like all those different systems might have a build step to actually take that, whatever the source of truth is, and transform into something Q understands. And so for me, I don't know if it's necessarily possible that we can model every system as a module that's published. I think at some point we do have to support taking something from a source and transforming into Q as a first step. Maybe, for example, in Kubernetes, we want a higher level library for working with Kubernetes, especially like on those the simple abstractions like deployments and stuff, like just get us working quickly in deploying something. But the source of truth is the Go code base or the open API schema. So at some point you will have to close over those and be able to reliably do that, and like build system abstractions like content addressable storage or like DAGs themselves. I think are going to be a key part to that. And that kind of is related to another point when we're talking about multiple version systems. I think it will be beneficial for Q to be maximally open in terms of like, I do think we probably would want to be able to model the universe of systems as well as all those versions of the systems at the same time, just in case for the thing. Those are like the more things that we're able to model and work with. That means they're all interconnected in Q. It makes Q more viable for those use cases and more valuable and like more sticky. It's like a more unique value proposition, I think, for Q. Like other systems are not doing this, and other tools are not doing this. So this is, I think, something that would probably benefit Q to pursue, although it's a much harder problem. Yes, because I think we're going to have to move into more build system kind of things.
So what specifically do you mean here? How does that relate to modules in this case? Can you give an example?
Yeah, for like Kubernetes, like fundamentally, you can define your own custom resource definitions, right? Like
Yep.
Anybody can do that. You can publish your own. So at some point, you have to be able to take whatever the source of truth that is, like if it's the Go code or an open API schema, and as part of like the evaluation of building a Q like configuration, you have to take that source, transform it into Q. Maybe it's like imported at a higher level by an actual handwritten package or used directly. But that's part of the build system now, right? That's part of the dependency graph for what makes that a value configuration in Q. So to do that successfully, like you have to have that source of truth, like as kind of modeled in the Q build system.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Like it's not just like something, I don't think it's feasible.
So not generate a module, but be able to depend on that directly.
Right. Like when we're talking about modules, that's like taking like fixed set of code, right? And like just kind of using MVS or something to compose them together. But I'm saying I think the computation to transform from one source to other is a key part of modeling that in Q. So it has to be part of the
Completely agree. And I just to briefly relate that back to what I was saying as far as the end goal here, as far as modules is concerned, is that, and I sort of referred to this in Richard's situation, but I think it's more general than that, is that if I'm understanding you correctly, one way of viewing that is to say, I want to address Kubernetes at version 1.28, for example. How that code that I depend on at version 1.28 is actually generated is sort of, in my mind, an implementation detail. And I think that chimes with what you're saying, in that if we leave the door open to the resolution of that being potentially the orthogonal, thank you, yes, to a function of how Kubernetes itself is built, then that's a good thing to leave the door open to that. And just to be clear, that's exactly what I think we are doing with modules. It's just you don't really care how that module is produced or published or whatever in some way, shape, or form, especially in a situation where you want to have a pin to a specific version of Kubernetes in that situation and depend on it in such a way. So I think we're on the same page, Cedric. I think you made a much grander point, though, about how we could integrate with other build systems. And that sounds wonderful. But I just want to make sure that you don't think we're heading down the wrong path here. It sounds like we're keeping the door open to it, i.e. we're all kind of on the same page.
I could visualize a tool that would say, for example, have to work with different Kubernetes clusters. And so it has to model an arbitrary version of Kubernetes.
Yes.
And so it would need to, like, if it uses Q, then Q would have to be able to simultaneously support all versions of Kubernetes at the same time. That would be an example of a system that would need that maximal support. In the terms of the general thing, like what I'm trying to say, I see what you're saying about the modules. I wonder if part of supporting modules would be to be able to have like the full build system. Like you had to have part of building module, like the transformation of some other source of truth as part of the publishing of that module. Like you take whatever source, it's part of, like, I guess going to be part of that OCI container, and then you can, so it's like, stable, like for, what do you call that, software supply chain purposes, and then you're able to transform it into Q, and it's like publish. It's like the part of the build step for publishing it, if that makes sense. But it has to be, it's like the part of the build graph. It'd be like fundamental.
Absolutely. I think that it's just a question of who ends up taking responsibility for that. And if there's a means by which a project can sort of manifest how that dependency graph in some way, shape, or form that some queue-based process could consume, great. If instead they need to own that process and generate the queue themselves, also great. If they want to use queue as the source of truth, that's another alternative. I hope we're not sort of backing ourselves into a corner with any of these. And that's really the goal, is to sort of leave the doors as open as possible when it comes to exactly that kind of interaction that you're talking about. When we're trying to almost be deliberately silent on how those artifacts are generated in some way and published in some way, shape, or form.
I think you make a good point in that at the minimum, I think Q needs an interface to like ensure there's some way like you can guarantee the provenance of this stuff, and like how do you get that into the module in a consistent way.
I'm keeping an eye on time. Sorry, folks, for running over slightly, but I don't want to cut people off too early. But at the same time, I think we might need to wrap it up fairly soon. Cedric, appreciate the contribution. Daniel, you've patiently had your hand up too.
I'll be very brief. We've been talking about what things can go away, like the gen directory. I should mention, and maybe we've mentioned it in passing, but to make it very clear, that there's a mode in QGetGo called local. And I don't think that's in any way related to modules, because that is transforming a local Go package to a local Q package. And we use that all the time ourselves for when you write your types in Go and then want to use them for Q configuration. And I don't ever, like you can, that's maybe the part of the transformation that are orthogonal to how you download or publish modules. But I think this, maybe it might be called something different, but I think this core, this simpler logic of just working in local mode, I think that's going to be the same.
Yeah, there's definitely a dynamic component that I could see come into play. I don't have any good examples, but like you like again, like with the CRDs, anybody can define anything if they need to be able to use it in Q. At some point, like to build a configuration, they got to be able to like define it themselves and like import it as part of like the generation. I don't know what step they use it, but like you could see like you might need to be able to configure, like generate at any time, even outside like the module context. So
yeah, and we have been thinking about these kind of things in different contexts also, and also to formally come more to terms with this, because of course with configuration, like one of the requirements that you would often find from SREs and stuff like that is to be really hermetic, right, and basically have predictable, reproducible results. But how do you marry that with these dynamic components, right? And I think we can find some good or interesting answers to that.
Yeah, I think we talked before about like the Q server kind of idea, and that was also one of those reasons why I talked about it, like more dynamic configuration.
And we also have this function extension, right? Like this real semantics around a function. It doesn't mean we have functions, but at least that you can declare foreign interfaces in Q and like all these kind of things.
Yeah,
and this also gives a much better handle on understanding like data flow and being very principled about it.
Cool. I think everybody understands that point, though. I do think it's important to start thinking about.
I feel very bad having to bring the meeting to an end. Thank you, everyone, for joining. A great way to kick off the new year. What we will do is, Richard, if you'll allow us, basically use your issue, I think, because it saves, there's no reason creating another issue, to sort of allow these open questions and ideas to ferment within there. And Rog is, I think, going to sort of kick the tires a bit on exactly what semantics we should go for as far as the interpretation of q.mod/gen is concerned for day one, and start landing something. I'll keep that vague for now until such time as we've ironed out what, at least from our perspective, are the main open questions. That would allow keen early starters like Richard to kick the tires again with something that doesn't break when you run qmod tidy in the presence of generated code, and hopefully take us a few steps forward until such time as somebody finds another issue that we'll happily tackle as and when we get to it. But if in the meantime, Colin, we will happily follow up with you afterwards if you're happy with that. Be great to talk about that. If anybody else has any other sort of you may not even sort of see it like a block or just wants to discuss stuff in the swirl that is generated code and modules, please just ping us in the modules channel. Very happy to set up time, even if it proves that there's sort of no issue. That's totally fine. If actually you just want to talk it through, that's great. It's much better to be catching these things sooner rather than later, and make sure the main goal being we're not blocking things, blocking people, or it's going off down blind alleys in some way, shape, or form. But with that, thank you very much, everybody, and we'll publish this recording, etc., and the slides, and look forward to seeing everyone in a couple of weeks' time.